This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. To learn more or to subscribe, visit beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. It's episode 393 of the Craft Beer Brewing Podcast. I'm Jamie Bogner, and it's that time of year again when we look back at the year of podcasts and reflect on your favorite episodes of the past 12 months. It was quite a year for me, and if I were compiling my own wrapped statistics, here's how they'd read: 55 podcast episodes, a number of craft beer brewing and spirits and distilling video classes, 9 magazine issues, 2 Minnesota Craft Beer Festivals, spring and summer, 2 brewery workshops, Austin and Fort Collins, 1 brewer's retreat at Dogfish Head, judging for own best in beer, as well as final tables at the Alpha King Challenge and the Polish Craft Roku competition. Travel to 5 countries, 18 different states, 43 flights, 98 nights on the road. I did a poor job of keeping track of all the beers that I drank on Untappd this year. Probably only checked in about half of what I tried, and that was still over 1,100 different beers. When we started the podcast in 2017, I had no idea it would come this far, but for the past couple of years, we've not only been the #1 brewing and beer podcast on Apple Podcasts, we've also consistently been in this like top 50, 60 of all food podcasts. A little bit on our listenership, about 75% USA. Australia is just over 5%. Canada, just under 5%. The UK clocks in around 3%. Then after that, it's Sweden and Germany, both around 1%. Japan, Denmark, New Zealand, Norway, Netherlands, France, China, Finland, Ireland, Mexico, Brazil, Spain, Belgium. The list goes on and on. There's really no country that isn't represented here in the downloads. Our metrics have even tracked 19 downloads from Antarctica. So thanks to whoever's been listening to the podcast from way down there. Over the course of this episode, I'm going to count down your favorite episodes of the past year according to those same metrics. And we're going to start with the 10th most listened to episode. But before we do that, at G&D Chillers, they always strive to build great chillers. Partner with them as you build great beer, but don't just take my word for it.
This is Andy Joint of Big Grove Brewery. We've been using G&D chillers from the beginning, and from our original 3.5 barrel pub system up to our production brewery, we've been able to rely on G&D to provide a high quality chiller, help us with design and layout, and provide support whenever we need it.
Choose G&D Chillers on your next expansion or brewery startup and receive 1 free year of remote control and monitoring of your new G&D chiller. And ProBrew is excited to now offer 2 to 4 week lead times on all in-stock Pro-Fill rotary can fillers and seamers. These models are available in 100 to 300 can per minute filling speeds and are built with a focus on scalability and low dissolved oxygen pickup. This special lead time is only while supplies last, so send them an email at contactus@probrew.com or call them at 262-278-4945. ProBrew. Brew your beer. Also, you may have heard of Old Orchard, but have you heard of their newest flavors? Berry Blend, Blood Orange, Lemonade, and Tart Cherry. They're the latest additions to their lineup of flavored craft juice concentrate blends. Old Orchard's R&D team can also formulate custom blends unique to your needs. To learn more and request your free samples, head on over to oldorchard.com/brewer. And now the 10th most listened to episode, number 364, featuring Thomas Vandelin out of Timmermans, Bourgogne de Flanders, and Waterloo. We recorded this one at the brewery in Bruges, but had toured and tasted with Thomas a couple days before the Timmermans brewery during the Tour de Guise. Thomas has a particular way of demystifying Lambic brewery, digging into the mechanics of spontaneous fermentation and understanding how to guide the development of flavor in favorable ways. Here is a highlight from the conversation.
We did a study very early on what bacteria and what yeast can be found in our brewery. We did CSI-wise swapping the cool ship, the barrels, the whole building to know what is really inside the brewery, what is in our cool ship when the inoculation starts. And we quickly found that it's quite a complex production. It's 118 different yeasts that are working together. Not all 118 will be active. Some will be only active for the first 24 hours and then disappear completely. And that's excluding the bacteria. So there's a whole range of bacteria as well that we didn't further control or checked according to their DNA. But that was a very interesting study because this learned us a lot. For instance, we took a lot of those yeast cells, took them we started with giant colonies and then started selecting the different yeast cells, growing them on different cultures, and then added them to fresh wort, to lambic wort, to see what their function was in the beer. Some were very phenolic, others were very fruity, others had a growth path which was very slow. So this learned us a lot on the whole development from lambic, coming from wort to a young lambic to an old lambic. At the same time, with the knowledge of Willem, for instance, added to that, we were able to analyze well our production methods. And I think it's important, first of all, to not talk about lambic as a wonder of nature, but it's really something which can be completely scientifically followed up. There's a lot of stuff that we still don't know for sure, but the product, the process itself, if we know what is inside what happens, we can control the lambic better during its aging. It all starts with the production of wort, of course. Lambic starts with at least 35% unmalted wheat, malted barley. We have the sliming method that you saw in Timmermans, where we take off the wort, which is, or the turbot mashing.
Right.
So during the mashing, where we have our unmalted wheat, 35%, and malted barley, we do a turbot mashing process. This to ensure that we can take off partly incomplete sacrificed sugars to our boiling kettle and stop the enzymes working. This all to create a wort at the end, which is harder to ferment. Because if we analyze the different yeast cells in our lambic, we'll see, for instance, Saccharomyces varieties. We'll see Pasteurianus, we'll see Cerevisia, we'll see Baianus, but we'll see also alternative yeast varieties like Pichia, Clocara, Zygosaccharomyces. And then you have the Brettanomyces varieties, which will come later into play. But those first two groups, they're important because they are glucose, maltose, maltotriose lovers. They'll be eating the short sugars and quickly starting the process. While the Brettanomyces, I always look into them as talking about tigers and wolves. It will sound very strange, but we've trained all along the history of men yeast to become something that we can control. Like a cat and a dog, we learn them to sit down, to listen. Cat is a little bit less great as a friend than dogs. They'll sometimes put their nails out and scratch. And that's what I compare to bottom fermentation. Because those yeast, well, you have to give them the right temperature, the right environment. If not, you'll have sulfur problems and other problems. While the dogs, they're the top fermenters. They're easier to work with. But the lions and the tigers and the wolves in nature, those are the Brettanomyces. They're a bit harder. They're used to living in very harsh environments. Give them a low temperature, give them stress, and they're changing in form to a Decara. They'll form coccus and survive in a very harsh environment. But give them food and they'll thrive. But they're also thriving on larger food groups where a cat and a dog needs to eat the little flaked stuff you buy in the shop. The tigers will attack a cow and eat it as well. So that in mind helps to give you an idea how lambic should be produced. You need to have the cows in there and not just the the dog and cat food. You have to create a wort
big game for them to go hunting after. Sure. And it might take longer to stalk that big prey and go take it down. Sure.
That's really a good way to look into Lambic.
In the number 9 spot for the year is Matt Cole of Fatheads, episode 376. He and I talked about it for a year or so before the circumstances aligned and I was able to fly out to Cleveland. But of course, Matt's viewpoints on IPA were as exciting for you as they were for me. Let's take a listen.
I wasn't really a big fan of Chinook last year. It definitely didn't seem to have the impact, the pine, the grapefruit, and I've read some things that maybe that it didn't quite have the same impactful, characteristics. So, with Headhunter, we buy from a couple different hop brokers that gives us a little flexibility, so we can say, okay, this is a little bit more impactful for aroma. This one's a little bit more impactful for the kettle. How can we kind of like manipulate that around to ultimately get the best out of what we have? So, we get flexibility and things like that. So, I really do believe that it every year, we can pull stuff out. We can put stuff in. The consumer really doesn't know the difference.
Tell me about that process. I'm curious about that. And
well, it's definitely challenging, and it's definitely one of those things that, what we select and then ultimately what gets pelletized and processed, and, then it becomes a whole different evaluation process for us after the fact that we've already gone through and selected this and that and this lot. And, so we ultimately bring it all in and kind of look at it from, a non-biased approach. And we always, don't really, I don't want to know who grew this or who did this, and we just throw it all out there. This is, Chinook, and there's 5 different lots, and we just let our nose kind of take it where it needs to go. And sometimes we've contracted for stuff that maybe, maybe isn't the best, the best bang for the buck. So what are we going to do? Are we going to, pull that back? So ultimately, we're just kind of like taking an everyday evaluation process of quality of each individual hop and how it's going to layer into the finished product. And sometimes when our beers go a little drift, I can kind of pinpoint it back to something that isn't quite shining the way that it should, or, so
you'll layer some stuff in. Do you like stage in new stuff so that you can kind of track some of the variables as they happen? So you have a new, crop year of a certain hop, and you'll just, now tap into that new year of it and then be able to taste it on, a couple weeks later as it comes out and be able to kind of track back, or, is it just a more broad process than that?
It's a little broader, but at the same time, like, we never change more than one variable pretty much at a time. Right. But we can kind of like get an idea of, if the aromatics aren't where it needs to be, and if the evaluation of the hop isn't what it needs to be, and it's not really giving us that the true characteristic of the hop, whether it's a Chinook with pine, grapefruit, all those characteristics, then ultimately we just do one batch of it different, and then we let sensory kind of drive it from there. So it really is manipulating raw materials to put our best foot forward. It's not rocket science, but it really is, having different levers to pull, and letting our sensory evaluation push the beer in different directions.
Great stuff from Matt. We'll get to number 8 in a second, but first, experience distinct transparency and juiciness with Omega Yeast's Daybreak 5. Using their Lumina technology, Omega genetically eliminated haze in the popular British 5 strain, allowing you to preserve the fruit-boosting prowess while achieving crystal clarity. It's perfect for modern West Coast IPAs. Learn more at info@omegayeast.com. And keep your brewery running smoothly with 5-star chemicals. Their cleaning solutions are specifically formulated to meet the unique needs of breweries, ensuring that your equipment stays clean and free of harmful bacteria and contaminants. From cleaning fermenters to kegs, they've got a solution for every step of the brewing process. Use 5-star chemicals today and taste the difference in your brews. Also, seam defects caused by minimal overlap may not be immediately apparent, but they can become problematic during distribution, leading to leaky pallets. Just because you're not experiencing leaks at your facility doesn't mean you're entirely safe. RSS Macklin offers training to help you understand not only what's happening with your seams, but also what you can do to fix it. Their comprehensive training ensures that you are equipped to identify and make proper corrective actions before they escalate. Visit them at rssmacklin.com. That's rssmaclin.com. Or email service@rssmacklin.com. All right, your 8th most listened to episode of the year is Robert Fulweiler of Meanwhile in Austin, Texas. They've got a gorgeous, humongous beer garden and beers that are just as stylish as those swanky environs. But Robert was focusing on streamlining processes and building production efficiencies. Let's take a listen.
The German Pils is our top selling brand. I think about 30% of what we produce is Pilsner. So we're brewing right now, at least we're brewing
There's so many craft brewers like,
I know it's pretty fun. That's
why can't that be, no, but this is Austin, Texas. That Pilsner is a lot of people's number one selling brand.
Yep.
Unless you're Pine House, where's Electric Jellyfish.
Right. Austin is a wonderful lager town. I believe Austin's won 4 out of 5 last GABF gold medals between ABGB, us, and Lazarus for German Pils. So yeah, there's a lot of great beer here to get inspiration from, and you have to bring your A game. That's table stakes to getting draft handles for Pilsner here in Austin, Texas. Mm-hmm. So, this Pils is super simple malt base. It's a couple different Weyermann Pils malts, the standard Pils and the extra pale, and then
it's a couple of different Pils malts. You're blending Weyermann.
Yeah, you got to get it just right.
That seems complex.
So it's probably, I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but I believe it's somewhere around 70% of regular Weyermann Pils, and then a little bit of the extra pale, which kind of lightens it up a little bit, maybe adds a little bit more to the sulfur character of the beer.
Interesting.
And then we have our brew house here.
The lighter produces more sulfur, you find?
And that's, I think so. But our brew house is we have a single, we have a combination mash lauter vessel. So we do a little bit of a step mash program, nothing too complicated, but with the Pils, we'll mash in, for like a protein rest and then step it up. No decoction. Yeah. Not yet anyways. Maybe a mash mixer or a mash kettle in the future, but not right now. And then we brew the beer a little bit high gravity, so we will we'll knock out into the kettle at finish topping off the kettle at like 13 Plato, but then and then run our boil hops and then add water at the end to kind of target a specific knockout gravity to the tank. So that helps with being able to consistently hit gravity. And then also on some of our other beers, that helps we can add cold water. It drops the whirlpool. We can add a lot of hops and not necessarily a ton of bitterness. So we can drop the whirlpool temperature either a little bit if we're adding hot water, or if we add cold water to bring the whirlpool temp down. We can add, then that, for like a hazy IPA, for instance, we can add a lot of hops at like 170 degrees and not pick up a ton of bitterness.
Sure. There's definitely that benefit of cool pulling. Now, obviously, from a process perspective, as you're packing that much malt into a high gravity brew, there's always that, danger of over extraction and, tannic character. How do you guys manage for that?
I would say it's almost the opposite. Actually, we kind of like underutilize the mash because we're not fully running off, if that makes sense. So a lot of our.
Okay. So you're just taking the.
Yeah, not That I'm not sure if that's on purpose actually, but that's kind of how it works right now. Is a lot of the beers we're not running to like super low last worts on the brew house. So yeah, maybe that actually helps with some of the tannic character, but
then you just have to have a pretty large mash tun in order to handle that much grain to be able to, stop loudering at a time where you can still keep the gravity. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And we do have steam jackets on the lauter tun, so that helps. We can kind of bring the mash up to help with lautering. The viscosity as the temperature comes up, the viscosity drops, and so we can lauter a little bit easier. Whereas at Fremont, we're doing a similar process, but we did not have any way to heat up the lauter tun. So if you mashed in a really dry beer, it just kind of stayed that way until the sparge water heated it up, and that made some lautering quite a bit more complicated or sticky.
Yeah. Do you adjust your water to grist ratio at all to handle this higher gravity piece?
I would say most of our mashes are pretty thin. That's something I've actually been working on, is try to thicken them up a little bit to get a little bit higher yield out of out of the mash. But yeah, we generally mash relatively thin. 1.5 quarts per pound right now is kind of like the standard number. But
in the 7 spot is an episode I recorded in Vermont back in March. It's Von Trapp, of course, and Tom and Jack share their brewing perspectives from this incredibly cool brewery perched on a mountainside, fed by a natural spring adjacent to the family's lodge. Let's listen in.
We pretty much step mash everything in-house here. Some of our other brews, we mash in a little higher to bring that malt sweetness, but, Hellas we mash in at 143 and then slowly raise up.
Yeah.
And, runoff is slow. We're trying to get as clear wort as possible. So wort clarification, super fine, longer time wort clarification, and just try to run off slow and boil longer for that roundness. And Jack, you have any input on that?
Yeah, and just definitely not letting last runnings get too low. We're very, very conscious of that.
Yeah.
Because, so many lagers out there have that just like astringent, grainy quality, possibly due to that. And that's something we definitely want to avoid.
And crush too. The crush of the grain. We're checking that. Yeah,
Tell me about that.
We just don't want it too fine. We do crush some powder, some flour in there. It does help bring out, expose some of those enzymes, but we still have a good husk and, sieve test, and see where it's at. And it helps with the runoff. And you could tell when your crush is off and you're struggling through a runoff, you know what's going on with your differential pressures and seeing how it's flowing.
Yeah. How do you balance the flour, the finer crush with that kind of
I want to say 10% possibly of it, and it's
And so while milling, you will change the mill settings.
No, it has a flour. It's a 4-roller Kunzel mill, and it does bring in that flour crush and
so it diverts while it's a certain portion of it.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah.
Interesting. How do you balance between those two?
Once the setting is there, it's kind of it's set. And then as the malt changes yearly, we can tell that the plumpness of it. So we look at the plump, and then we get a sample, and then if it's, like I said, the runoff is struggling, or it's by just millimeter, like really small adjustments, and just maybe open it up a hair, and just kind of adjust accordingly that way.
Do you do that each time you get new shipments, or the COAs? How often do the COAs change on those?
COAs, it's usually like yearly.
Okay.
Yeah. So the COA, we get we probably order once every 2 weeks, Pilsner, 50,000 pound, and we get the COA. And the biggest adjustment is not the size of the malt. It's more the pH we're seeing that we have. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so that really
not protein levels, it's pH.
Yeah, the protein levels are holding pretty true. I'm gonna say like 9 to
10.
9 to 10. But it's more
those nice European barley lower protein levels.
But some people say you might also want to check them. Just because double check.
Okay,
That's it. But yeah, it's more
trust but verify, right?
Exactly. So, but the pH is what we use acidulated malt to balance that, and that's what.
How much variety are you seeing in pH on that?
It's at like 6 right now, and maybe up and down. Half a point. That's it. Not too much, but enough.
But enough that you need to balance that out.
Yeah, absolutely.
Interesting.
And then Jack, what would you say about like the adjustment of the pH and how it affects the beer?
Obviously we're looking for a knockout around like 5.2 or so, and after fermentation, hopefully 4.2 to 4.4, and we're generally hitting that. Our water source is pretty stable, consistent pH. So yeah, it's mostly just brew house where that's coming from. But yeah, I think we can knock that with acidulated. So if we're brewing a 200, we'll get 4 turns. So if we notice something on the first turn, we can adjust on turns 2, 3, and 4 just to, accommodate that.
Sure.
And we're not using lactic or phosphoric. We're using the acidulated malt, trying to be as traditional.
Number 6 is up next, but first, Indie Hops breeds new hop varieties to help brewers captivate beer lovers. Brewers worldwide trust Indie's unique varieties, Strata, Lorien, Luminosa, Meridian, and Audacia, to modernize, brighten, and diversify their beer lineup. Indie also offers classics that thrive in Oregon terroirs, such as Chinook, Crystal, and Sterling. Thoughtfully crafted and selected hops to meet your brewing needs. Visit indiehops.com/podcast to discover what's new in hop flavors. Indie Hops, life is short, let's make it flavorful. And Berkeley Yeast, founded by bioengineers, yeast that's designed to improve flavor, quality, and consistency, increase efficiency, and save you money. If you've been following Yeast, I'm sure you've heard about their strains. Super Bloom strains make classic hops flavors. Fresh strains keep diacetyl low, even with large hop additions. Tropic strains make a tropical bouquet reminiscent of the finest Southern Hemisphere hops. And they just dropped new strains that are even more futuristic. Nationwide free shipping. Mention this podcast for 20% off your first order. Now, your 6th most listened to episode of 2024. It's Natalie Rose Baldwin, a Wayfinder. And so, of course, we talked about cold IPA. Let's roll the tape. Do you now vary the yeast between cold IPA and West Coast IPA, or do you now also use lager yeast for your West Coast IPAs and simply change the grain bill so that it's not that adjunct focus?
I've done a little bit of both. Right now, just because of hustle bustle, I've been using some ale yeast for our West Coast IPA. And, we have talked about kind of switching that to 3472, but it's a little bit more of, I need more yeast to be able to do that. And it's easy to get
Can't you just prop it up with, your lagers? Come on.
Yeah, right. Then we need it for lagers. But, so my approach to West Coast IPA, and again, a funny part is, you're as far along in your career as I am, 10 years in, and pretty established. And a lot of these things I haven't done before because I didn't have to, working at a big company. So this year was my first year doing hop selection. One of the reasons was because when hop selection happened and I was offered the opportunity at Breakside, I was doing wine harvest. And so I wasn't able to do hop selection. And, I've participated in conversations around it and knew extensively about our hop lots and things like that, but I had never done that by myself. So this year was my first year, and we're a smaller brewery, so hop selection isn't necessarily the most accessible thing. And YCH had a really cool open door project this year that allowed some smaller breweries to come in and do hop selection on sort of excess hops that weren't contracted for. And, it's nerve-wracking to do that for the first time by yourself. And we have a small team and we're busy and weren't able to send more people up this year. So it was me by myself selecting hops. And I'm like, well, hopefully I know how to do this. And I've learned a lot. My best friend, Sam, works at Von Ebert, and he's sort of been my steward through a lot of the hop stuff because that's one of his big passion projects. And, we talked through the hop contracts that we have at Wayfinder and sort of which ways I wanted to move things and adjust. And when I didn't really know what our West Coast IPA was going to be because I didn't know what I wanted to do yet, I didn't really know what to contract. And, working with my suppliers and all that kind of stuff has been a really fun learning curve for me, honestly. And so that's kind of my approach to West Coast IPA is getting down and learning more about my raw materials and picking and choosing, our West Coast flagship right now is called Winged Creatures, and it's Old Faithful. It's the exact opposite what Kevin says in his cold IPA lecture. Like, don't do Citrus Simcoe Mosaic, but guess what, Kevy?
Yes. The truth comes out.
It
does work. It does work.
We're making a really cool beer, and then we can kind of branch off of that. And we're a newer team together and making dope beer. And
that brings us to the number 5 spot and the first but not last panel discussion on the top episodes list. This industry spotlight pod with Earls Wellhoner of Boston Beer, Bob Coons of Highland Park, and Grant Lawrence of Fermentis explored ways of creating expression in lager fermentation. Let's take a listen.
We first started making Timbo, I think, in 2015. So that's our West Coast Pilsner, kind of like our flagship beer. It was a mashup of a German Pilsner and a West Coast IPA. We ultimately just really liked the drinking experience and the results. And that led us to manage our yeast utilizing lager yeast. So we were juggling 3 different strains, some sort of hazy yeast strain, some sort of like Chico Cal Ale strain, and then the 3470. And so then to prioritize our yeast management side, sometimes we would sneak in the lager strain for the Cal Ale strain on our IPAs, and nobody knew the difference. If anything, internally, we were like, yep, best batch of, good green ever, best batch of LOLA ever. And so that was kind of like an internal little like secret, probably like 2015 through 2018 or something like that. But the more we were making Timbo, there was, I say we're sensory driven. So there's this practical side for me that's like, okay, what's the flavors we're trying to achieve? How are we like reaching that? And for me, I love the like bright tropical sort of like passion fruit and resinous and citrus peels and that sort of expression. And we were just finding that when we were making hoppy beer with lager yeast, we were getting more of the results that we liked. So, essentially we slowly, that sort of like sneaking in the 3470 lager yeast for our IPAs at one point, I think around 2018, maybe, we just were like, this is dumb. Let's make all of our West Coast hoppy beers with 3470. It's going to streamline our yeast management. Let's just own that. Like, we like this profile. We're not a dogmatic brewery. We're not caught up on like, oh, is it two style? Is it, X, Y, or Z? It's like, what's the flavor we're going for? Can we achieve that? And we got that more with 3470. Seems like there's, at a very, if I was just to like couple like hit points of why we like it, it's like, first, I think that the sulfur interaction with hops gets us those brighter sort of tropical notes. But then the next thing that's maybe even equally as important, and I don't really know the science behind it, but I want hoppy low ABV beers personally. And sometimes with the like ale yeast strains and like Cal Ale, Chico strains, they're a little bit thinner, a little bit lighter bodied, and we were finding with 3470, they were just had a little bit more body, a little more weight to the beer. So we could kind of like load up and saturate the hop presence in the beer, but still have the backbone of structure for the beer. And so those are kind of like the two main things. We were getting a hop expression we liked more, and we were getting the palate experience that we really liked. And, ultimately it was like, had less to do with the like, whatever we labeled the yeast we were using or whatever we labeled the style. It was like, what's our vision for the flavor expression and the palate experience and the overall consumer enjoyment of it. It's a little bit of an uphill battle to communicate that to consumers. It's like I think we compartmentalize things to better understand it. So, we're facing sort of like okay, how do we explain this? What do we communicate? But then once they like have it, it's like, yep, this is what I want. This is like the drinking experience that I want.
Your number 4 most listened to episode is similarly lager focused. This one's episode 352 with Chris Loring of Notch. Chris, of course, has some well-considered opinions on how brewers should approach European-style lagers, and he gets into the details in this episode. Let's listen.
Decoction means that you're going to create flavors and aromas that otherwise can't be achieved. And I don't care if you think you can do it otherwise. Yeah, you can. Modern malts will allow you to produce beer, to create sugar and ferment without decoction. But, decoction is, basically creating melanoidins, and you can't do that otherwise. Yeah, you can get melanoid in malt, but that substitute doesn't work. I've tried that. That's just trying to do something as a shortcut. So, first off, the Czechs are great at not discarding processes that lead to very great beer, because modern technology has allowed you to, forget about that through either labor savings or cost savings. The Czechs don't want to hear that. You need to do it. That's a wonderful thing that they've kept that. Open fermentation is a big thing. Not everyone does it, but open fermentation, and the reasons why, an open fermenter, provides a yeast environment to create flavors and aromas that otherwise you can't achieve. That is still pretty relevant and prevalent. However, the fermentation procedures are very interesting to me, and they mimic to some extent the Franconian brewers in that how you take a beer from a fermenter into a lagering tank, and how you are dealing with temperature and yeast cell contribution to reduce diacetyl. And this is where it gets into kind of the minutia, right? Where most Czech brewers arrest fermentation before the beer is completely fermented out. And it could be a degree Plato, it could be 5 degrees Plato above where it's supposed to be, and it's moved into a horizontal lagering tank, and it's left to sit for a number of months or weeks. And the yeast sometimes does its job, and takes the diacetyl precursor, turns it into diacetyl, and reabsorbs it into the yeast cell. Sometimes it doesn't. Right. And it's not too far from what a lot of the German brewers do in terms of doing the same kind of procedure, but there has to be a repeatability there to have a consistent outcome. And I just haven't seen the repeatability a lot in the Czech Republic. I've seen a lot of brewers have variability in what they're producing, and for reasons I don't understand. And this is some of the coursework that I did. And my professor was he's ex-Pilsner Urquell, and I had long conversations with him about why do Czech brewers have such great variability, even among the same brewer with diacetyl that's produced. And he just shrugged his shoulders and didn't even want to get into the conversation. So that in itself, spoke a lot to me about Czech brewing, and that a lot of it's not by intention. It's just a result. It's not to say German brewers are necessarily better. We've discovered that some German brewers will have diacetyl in their beers for the same reasons. They didn't have the same conditions that were needed to have diacetyl basically reduced during the latter stages of fermentation, and then that produces diacetyl within that beer. So
talk to me about that process.
So in diacetyl production, or for diacetyl reduction, I should say. So in fermentation, you'll have precursors known as acetolactate. And that precursor is not something that we can smell or taste unless it's oxidized. And in the brewing process, you will have an environment where you're not going to oxidize the beer in your fermenter or your lagering tank. So it can be there and you don't know it. So acetolactate will be, that precursor will turn into diacetyl and then reabsorbed by the yeast cell, or the yeast cell, just through a natural state of low pH, and then time and temperature. So if your temperature is at a certain range and you have enough time, it's going to naturally take care of itself. You won't even know it. And there's a way to test this to make sure that pathway is complete. If you don't test for it, you're kind of at the whim of the yeast actually doing its thing without you knowing about it. So let's take an example. You produce a beer, you arrest fermentation with like a degree Plato left to go, and you put it in your lagering tank, and you don't have enough yeast cells in suspension, and you package that beer, right? It still has the precursor present. Over time, that beer will oxidize, and that acetolactate will then turn into diacetyl in the beer and present itself as butter, either in package or through draft, right? And you wouldn't know that unless you did a test for it.
A beautiful way to explain why many brewers are like, well, my beer didn't have diacetyl in it.
Right.
And then it does.
Because it didn't. It had the precursor. So you need to make sure the precursor goes to diacetyl, and diacetyl is then reabsorbed by the yeast cell. So I think one of the benefits of having lagering tanks where you can park it there for 3 months was that this was going to naturally take care of itself, and that if you have enough yeast cell present, pH is there, and the temperature is such that the yeast can still work. It will reabsorb that. But if any of those conditions aren't there, you're going to have a beer with diacetyl. So American brewers, this kind of leads into I think why Czech beer can be so wonderful, and why American versions of lager can be somewhat homogenized and not so great. I mean, good beer, but not great beer. So a lot of American brewers abide by a fermentation procedure where you fermented, say, 55 degrees. And near the end of fermentation, you raise that temperature. And raising that temperature, accelerates this process of acetolactate turning into diacetyl and then being reabsorbed by the yeast cell. And so then at the end of that, you can just crash that beer. You're definitely through the diacetyl rest. You've tested that it's not there. And then you can crash that beer and serve it. Yeah, you've reduced the amount of diacetyl in that beer, and you've got it to a point where you're not going to have butter. But that beer's not really distinctive, because raising that temperature and crashing that beer has basically just quickened the process of making lager. And if there's one thing that we've learned about lager is you got to be patient with it. And the more time you give it, the better it's going to be. And the quicker you make it, the less distinctive it's going to be. It's still going to be a good beer, just not going to be as distinctive as it could be. So, if you are able to take your beer into a lagering tank at the right temperature with the right amount of yeast cells in suspension at the right pH, as long as you give it time, you're going to get there, right? But I think some brewers just arrest fermentation in the Czech Republic and they don't realize what's happening, right? That they have a production schedule that they hit, and there's not a metric to reduce that diacetyl.
That brings us to the top 3, and it's another panel discussion in this third spot. This one features Chris White of White Labs, Julian Trago of Beechwood, and Garrison Frattoni of Russian River. They jumped into this conversation on healthy fermentations. We talked more about zinc in one episode than I ever thought we could. Here's a snippet.
When I talked to Sierra Nevada about dosing zinc, they do still perform it on the hot side. I hope I'm not giving away any trade secrets. They still perform it on the hot side, but they have a very extensive lab, and they've correlated the losses that they regularly see on average in wort, and they compensate for that. And that works for them. And Chris, I'm sure you can attest to the fact that zinc rates, while there is a general range, some yeast are way more sensitive to zinc levels than others, and some benefit quite a bit more. I read in a couple places in some older publications that lager yeast requires half the zinc of ale yeast, but that wasn't really substantiated by anything, or there wasn't any supporting hypothesis like it requires less because of this biological reason. We found the opposite. We found that our lager strains are much more sensitive to zinc deficiencies, and we have to hit that certain level. I don't worry. If I left out zinc entirely, I wouldn't worry about getting a clean beer out of certain ale yeast. It might not land in exactly the place that I want, but I wouldn't be overly concerned with it. With a lager strain, if we left out zinc, I'd be like, it's anybody's guess as to where this one ends up.
Yeah. It's a fascinating topic. I mean, I could talk forever. I'd love that these guys are really dialed in because it has an impact on their beers. Look, most craft brewers aren't doing anything with zinc, and you don't have to make beer. That's the important thing, right? You don't have to with fermentation. So many of the things we could talk about fermentation, you don't have to. But do you want to try to make some of the world's greatest beers? This is what makes the difference. This is what makes a difference in fermentation, yeast health, flavor, flocculation. But if you don't, your fermentations look okay. As mentioned, it's really hard to measure zinc. And for most of brewing's history, you couldn't. So when you can't measure something, it's very hard to control something. So everybody talk about pitching rate. Okay, that's cool. You can measure that. But it turns out that zinc and oxygen levels are very much harder to measure, have a huge impact on how the yeast grow. It's not just what you add. The yeast has to grow. That's where the flavors come from. That's where beer comes from, yeast growth. So these kind of details are really important if you want to just move beyond, good beer to great beer. And also, remove some of those little problems that happen once in a while, which do cost you money. Because when you have better fermentations, you have less troubleshooting to do for problem fermentations. So it's not as a new topic. When I started, like I said, going to meetings and stuff 30 years ago, the old timers were talking about, hey, the secret, to fixing fermentation problems was a little zinc powder. And then I had a talk with, the famous Dr. Michael Lewis, right? Most people know him from the first UC Davis brewing professor, still in Davis, and retired, right, of course. But anyway, 1963, right, coming on to UC Davis as a brewing professor. And we had a talk in the 90s or early 2000s when we were working on zinc that he said something very interesting. Why does zinc addition make a difference? There should be enough zinc from the malt, right? We're going back to these numbers, what's supplied by the malt. So why is it making a difference? He said something very smart. He said, it must be deficient, but we don't know why, because it wouldn't be making a difference in fermentation. So, been worked on for a long time. And then, with dry hop beers and hop creep being a bigger factor with all these tremendous amounts of hops used, it's have a resurgence of interest because it can reduce hop creep time because yeast are more healthy. They're doing everything better. And I guess just sort of one more story interrelated here is after Jamil Zanishev and I wrote that yeast book back in 2010, he started Heretic Brewery. And after a couple of years, they were having some fermentation problems. And his brewers were like, oh, this, that, this. He said, let's just focus on the fundamentals we just wrote about. So they dialed in their oxygen concentration. And this was before we were measuring zinc. So Heretic was next to Anheuser-Busch in Fairfield. They nicely measured the zinc form. And it was 0. And they were adding zinc. They were adding nutrients in in the whirlpool, into boil whirlpool like people do, just wasting their money. And they thought, oh, okay, let's add it on the cold side. And other people were talking about it too. And so the next time I went back to Heretic to visit, the brewers were almost laughing and giddy at how great everything was going. Their oxygen was right, their zinc was right, and now they had just made a 12% barley wine with California ale yeast, and just saying how clean it was and how all these little fermentation problems went away. But these were things that were hard to fix before if you didn't know they needed to be dialed in. So Heretic did the same thing, started autoclaving, autoclaving a zinc solution, stock solution to make it sterile, adding it in with the yeast pitch and seeing really quick results. That's exactly why we did Cervomyces over, in the early 2000s, over 20 years ago with Lallemand, because in order to protect zinc from the hot side into the cold side. We just never thought of adding it on the cold side back then, I guess.
And the number 2 spot is a 2023 podcast, but since our fiscal beer year is GABF to GABF, as anyone who listens knows, this one made the list. It's Hot Takes on Cold IPA, featuring Firestone Walker's Sam Tierney, Hop Butcher's Jude LaRose, and Kevin Davey of Heater Allen and Gold Dot. Here is a clip.
I think it's interesting because like when you say like on paper, it's a lot like you can make the argument that it's IPL. I think it's interesting because it's kind of like one of these things that it's like a developing style. And so you have people that whether it fits exactly into what I was thinking of as cold IPA, whether it has the adjunct load, like I know that Hopnosis might not have the adjunct load that I think is indicative in the style, but I still think it fits because you're kind of getting to the same finish line, whether you want it or not. Right. And what I think is interesting is that as the style progresses, even if there is going to be differences, like people still are going to want to call it cold IPA because the pie in the sky of what that beer is not going to change. People are going to want something that is clear, crisp, expressive of hops, expressive of new hops in a way that IPL never really achieved. And I feel bad for that because I know that there's a lot of great brewers that have introduced IPL, and I specifically say this to brewers near my heart, which are lager brewers like Enegren and Jack's Abbey and people that make IPL and are behind IPL. And I feel like they're probably the ones that I feel the worst when they're upset about cold IPA, because I'm like, these are my guys. These are the lager guys, you know? And I don't want them mad at me. But I think that maybe it was my tenure at Firestone. I have like an IPA streak on in me that, you know, the other lager brewers just don't really have. I don't know. Maybe I do, maybe I don't. I just wanted to be even just more aggressive, more punch in your face, and just different. And I think that's the driving force in cold IPA, is that I think it is able to stand out as being its own thing. I'm sorry, I'm going on a total tangent, but IPL is very close to cold IPA, but you know, steam beer is really close to American amber lager. What's the difference? It's the people brewing it. It's what they're trying to achieve with what they're making, and it's what they want to call it.
Kevin, I think you're spot on. I think that if I remember correctly, the kind of like what you wanted to do is there was a lot of hazy IPA out, and you kind of wanted to, you know, kind of take the piss out of it a little bit. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but then you said, like, let's kind of, you know, build this like a malt liquor, and let's also load it up with hops. And I think that when we saddled up to the bar and we had it, it didn't feel like a gimmick. It landed like IPA. And yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of like IPLs, you know, they had a different profile, and maybe they were a little clunky. I think that, you know, one of the first IPLs I ever had was like a Mikkeller half-acre collab called Guest Lager that they released out of their original location. It was hopped with Nelson Sauvin. And looking back on that to me, if I went back, I feel that would taste like cold IPA. Like that beer always made sense. But, you know, and when we talk about, there's like two things. One, when we talk about innovation, or we talk about what's like the next big thing, and you take a look at what Hazy IPA, you know, its place in the brewing world, or what it did and how it took everything by storm, and we wonder where it's coming from next. Kind of the process changes, and cold IPA definitely has a place. There is a profile of those beers it's not West Coast Pilsner, it's not Italian style Pils, it's not hoppy lager. I mean, you know it when you taste it. So I think it's kick-ass, and what I think it's done, and how we look at other beers and how we approach other beers. I mean, I think it's huge.
I think there's a lot to be said here too for the power of branding, and I think we often throw that, think of that as this kind of skeezy thing. But if you look at the history of beer, man, throughout the last 150 years of the industrial world of beer, being able to sell that beer is pretty important, and having great terms that actually sell that. You look at the evolution of the words like stout and porter, what they mean and what those beers are that are sold under those things. Those things changed over 30, 40 years. As customers' tastes changed. The idea of what pale lager is very different, depending on where you are. But the idea of these things, and the idea of a name for something, being able to sell it, is important. And let's just be honest, like cold IPA sounds way more awesome than India Pale Lager. India Pale Lager is also a kind of hacked together term, a mashup of some things that doesn't have a historical precedent, nor does cold IPA in that sense. But, what would you order if you saw it on a menu? I just see cold IPA and think, hey, that's great. That's my soapbox, on that whole thing. And with that, we get to the most listened to episode of the past year, which interestingly enough, they focused on Hazy IPA. We got the West Coast IPA gang back together. That's Vinny Chilurzo of Russian River, Evan Price of Green Cheek, Kelsey McNair of North Park, and we added Steve Parker of Fidens into the mix for a deep dive into the Hazy IPA creative direction and technical process. This episode is not only the most listened to episode of 2024. Over the course of this year, it became our second most listened to episode in history, second only to their own episode, the West Coast IPA Now episode number 286. Really a force of nature, this group, and thanks to them for sharing their thoughts with all of us out here in podcast land. Let's give it a listen.
The dosing rate, when we're talking about flowable concentrated hop products that we're knocking out onto a dip hop, we typically stick to around 1 kilogram per turn, and like I said, we're usually kettle full at 19 barrels at knockout and might knock out 17 and a half into the tank. We've gone as high as 2 kilograms and some of those beers are awesome, but expensive. And so we kind of save that for special projects. But yeah, I mean, it's very similar to what I've described before, where we're taking about 3/4 to a full barrel of wort that is sitting at our cool pool temp of about 165 to 170 degrees. We're sending that through the heat-X into a tank that already has the flowable preloaded. We'll let that steep for a few moments. We'll continue to knock out at an adjusted knockout temperature that'll get us to our target pitching temp. And the one thing that you have to keep in mind when you're utilizing this process is you will have a stratified layer of hot wort that's, at a temperature that will kill your yeast. So, if you're pitching in the top or something with a fresh pitch, or otherwise, you absolutely need to burp the tank through the cone with some CO2, which if you do this for about 30 seconds, and we've trialed this when the wort is at the manway door level, so you can actually put your hand on the door and feel that it is, exceedingly hot. About 30 seconds of bubbles through the cone, at maybe 20 psi is enough to cause a homogenization and bringing it to a temperature where the tank is pretty safe to go ahead and pitch. And we're still getting up to speed with some of this equipment on our end. We haven't been checking our O2 levels in our wort stream and knockout, but when I did a brew at the propagator with Sam Firestone, we did check the differential between the O2 levels pre and post this burp that we did through the cone, and it wasn't enough to disrupt the amount of dissolved O2 that we wanted in the wort to have happy, healthy yeast. But definitely an important step, because that's if you're talking a barrel, 3/4 of a barrel out of 15 barrel tank, whatever you're knocking out, that's a lot of heat that's in a small amount of area. So, but
are you Evan and Steve, are you guys using the Kelsey flowable high oil technique as well?
No, not for our, no, we, for most of our hazies, we just use pellets in the whirlpool. Like I said, we do 2 pounds per barrel. The reason we go that high, and we go about 180 on our whirlpool, I go that high because I'm trying to push as many of those survivable compounds into that tank to last through fermentation. And I also believe at that point, I mean, they talk about biotransformation with the contact of yeast and hops. I mean, if I'm pushing that much hops in there, I mean, what better time for my yeast to interact with my hops is at that beginning stage of fermentation. And so we knock out, I mean, are we just getting into that, or do you want to get into fermentation stuff? Or are we just?
That's my next question. So if you want to roll in, I'll just throw out. Actually, let's let Evan answer, because I'm curious. Because I actually don't know if Evan uses the high oil extracts in the brews. I mean, being that you make a little caricature of Kelsey on the brew logs, I'm pretty sure you do. But
we use it more for West Coast than we do for Hazy IPA, honestly, because we're looking for just enough hop character to do exactly like what Steve's talking about with the biotransformation, to where we can have, a beer that before we dry hop smells like an IPA. Because I think that when we've tried to do, there's enough breweries I've talked to out there that do a hazy IPA where they do no hopping at all in the kettle. They don't even do what Kelsey's talking about, and then they dry hop the beer. And I think those beers just have a hole in the middle, and they don't have that biotransformation, for lack of a better term, that you can get via Whirlpool editions or Kelsey's technique. And I think that's needed in order for it to get into the right spot.
So I have a question about fermentation temperature. Are you all thinking about this? Like you hear a lot now, especially with like West Coast IPAs, I'm going to bring down that primary fermentation temperature, sometimes even using lager yeast, like Highland Park does, and many others, trying to give it a clean slate? Or are you thinking of this as like a warmer fermentation? It's an English yeast often, so maybe it's more estery and that's going to meld with the hops. I'm curious where you're all at there. Evan, you take it.
Yeah, so for fermentation, we are, for single IPA, we're typically knocking out at 66 degrees to ferment at 68 degrees with a free rise to 70, 2/3 of the way through fermentation. And then we're harvesting day 3 or 4, depending on activity. And then we're immediately dry hopping.
Is that different than West Coast IPA?
I think for West Coast, we're like for sure day 4, and that activity that I mentioned earlier is so important to make sure that we have fermentation still happening. It's like this perfect moment that at least our brewery is waiting for, where fermentation has slowed down just enough to where we can harvest yeast, because we need to do that. Otherwise, we would spend incredible amounts of money, which I think we already do. But yeah, man, we do. Anyway, but for West Coast, on the other hand, I mean, day 4, we're not looking for haze, since that's not important. But on the double and triple IPAs, on the other hand, we are fermenting a little bit cooler at 65 degrees, and then the highest it gets is 68 degrees. But yeah, I think overall we do a really low pitch rate on these beers, and then a really high oxygen amount. And so, we are a brewery that counts cells for all pitches. And so we are pitching these beers at 375,000 cells per milliliter per degree Plato. And so that's over half of the normal pitch rate that you would use in a normal ale fermentation. But then we're hitting it at like 20 parts per million on O2 at knockout to keep that just absolutely rocking. And so those two things, I think, really help. And then what else should I tell you? I think
you're intentionally stressing, and then you're intentionally also aiding and assisting.
Yeah. Hey,
and are
for a
all of
non-brewer, you threw out some good shit, Jamie. I'm like, that was good, dude.
Are all of your tanks single batch, or are they any of them double batches?
I was totally gonna nerd out on that too, but I felt like I was talking for too long, Vinny. But yes, they are double batch brews.
Do you do it over 2 days, or fill the tank in 1 day?
So it's 2 days of brewing for that, and we're actually, and this is where it gets even smaller of a pitch. We're only pitching that amount of yeast for the single first batch. And instead of calculating the total amount for both batches.
Yeah,
he's doing
term,
it. Yeah,
drought. Yeah, Jamie and I talked about this the other day. But that term Drauflausum is brewing into 1 tank over 2 days is something that we've found, that we've learned from some other breweries, is like you're stressing the yeast somehow, and it's really aiding in haze, and that has worked for us. So I'm curious, Kelsey and Steve, if you guys are doing that.
Wait, how do you spell this?
Drauflausum. I don't know how it's spelled. It's just German for brewing over a couple days.
Love it. Drauflausum.
Yeah, if you can Google it on the Craft Beer and Brewing podcast or website, and I think it comes up.
That's probably one of the Oxford companion definitions.
Exactly. Thank you, Garrett.
Yeah.
Thank you, Garrett Oliver.
And there you have it, the 10 most listened to episodes of 2024. Choose G&D Chillers on your next expansion or brewery startup and receive 1 free year of remote control and monitoring. ProBrew offers 2 to 4 week lead time on all in-stock rotary can fillers and seamers. Old Orchard is the go-to source for fruit-forward ingredients for some of the biggest names in the craft brewing landscape. Omega Yeast's Daybreak 5 gives you juicy modern hop flavors without the haze. 5-Star Chemicals cleaning solutions are specifically formulated to meet the unique needs of breweries. Take back control of your canning and seaming with the experts at RSS Macklin. Trust Indie Hop's unique varieties to modernize, brighten, and diversify your beer lineup. And Berkeley Yeast strains are designed to improve flavor, quality, and consistency. If you've listened to this past year of podcasts here on the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast, go to beerandbrewing.com, click on that subscribe button, and help support our mission to bring great brewing content to you week after week, month after month, year after year. We just celebrated the anniversary, our 11th year in business here, and we couldn't do it without you. We depend on you. We depend on our subscribers to support what we do. And so please go to beerandbrewing.com, click on that subscribe button, spend some of that holiday cash, and give yourself another gift that will keep on giving for the next year. Of course, we've got more in store for you in 2025, important conversations that will impact how you brew. Stay tuned every Friday and select Tuesdays through the next year as we dive into essential brewing conversations with the best and the most creative brewers in the business. Thank you all for listening. Thank you all for sharing your time with us, the most valuable thing that any of us have. We'll be back in 2025 with more. Cheers. This podcast has been brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those who love to make and drink great beer. To learn more or to subscribe, visit beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.